He thinks the more disorder that he can generate, the better excuse he has for calling off the election. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I actually believe this. I think he knows if he loses the election, he's done with Epstein because the Democrats are going to subpoena everything, including him.
James, in this extraordinary week, there's no one better to describe Trump's war in the Middle East, where the official rationale changes daily, sometimes hourly, than Max Boot, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, award-winning author, and columnist for the Washington Post. Max, we don't have time to list all the Trump administration's shifting explanations or speculation. Imminent nuclear threat, Israelis made me do it, regime change, existential need to obliterate their missiles which are about to hit us. Please, Saudi Prince MBS, wag the dog to get Epstein off the front page. They're countless, and they do change every day. Why do you think he started this war?
Well, that's a great question. I think the most convincing explanation I've seen is that there has been some reporting that Trump is looking to leave a historical legacy beyond, simply the White House ballroom, that he wants to uh, wipe out these regimes that have been a thorn in America's side for all these years. And so he deposed the leader in Venezuela. He's trying for regime change in Iran. And likely, if he's successful or even not so successful in Iran, he'll probably turn to Cuba next. So he's trying to make kind of a clean sweep of the board, I think, before he leaves office. And of course, this is coupled with his zanier ambitions to expand American territory by adding Canada or Greenland to the U.S.
Max, I'm not going to, I wouldn't miss any of those leaders, starting with Khomeini, but they have tried to say that this was a preemptive strike, that they were about to attack us. I think it's been clearly demonstrated, including from American intelligence, that's a lie. It was not a preemptive strike. They decided to do it. It was a war of choice. For all the good riddance of the supreme leader and others, there's a second day. It's not just the first day. The strikes and the intelligence were near perfect. We know that. But you understand this. I mean, you remember Iraq. It gets tougher now. So what do you see ahead, and what are some of the perils?
Well, that's a great question. And Alan, I think as a recovering Iraq War supporter, I have to say that there are some disturbing parallels here, including although there's some obvious differences, the big one being Trump doesn't seem to be seriously contemplating sending ground troops, but in the way that the justification for the war keeps shifting, and also the end state that we're seeking keeps shifting. But Trump is at least flirting with regime change, although if you listen to Pete Hegseth and Dan Kane at the Pentagon, they're talking about simply degrading Iraq's capacity to threaten its neighbors, which I think is certainly a doable and realizable military objective. I mean, there is no question that we are degrading Iranian military capabilities as we speak, but some of the more grandiose ambitions that Trump has expressed, I don't think are terribly realistic. And they're at odds with one another, because on the one hand, when he first announced the strikes, he told the Iranian people to rise up and the security forces to lay down their arms. But he's also been talking about how he'd love to see an Iranian Delcy Rodriguez, i.e., some figure in the current regime who will make deals with him. And I don't think either one is terribly realistic. I don't think either one is going to emerge out of this bombing. But you're also seeing the administration now flirting with other options, including there have been reports that they're arming the Iranian Kurds. And I think that's something that's cause for great concern, because it sounds like in the pursuit of regime change that Trump may be willing to start a civil war in Iran. I don't think anybody really wants to see Iran become, Syria 2.0, Libya 2.0, Afghanistan 2.0, and least of all, the Iranian people. And I think if there's one thing that would lead, Persian nationalists to rally around the regime, it's the threat of the U.S. arming separatists who are trying to destroy the Iranian state.
Well, I think what this underscores, and when you talk about helping the courage, the deja vu to 2003 comes back again. I think what this underscores is, Max, they didn't have any planning for day two. They just knew they could be tough in day one. I mean, look at all those poor Americans stranded in those countries over there. There was no preparation for that at all.
Right.
The shifting explanations, the lies, and again, there may be some good stuff that comes out of this, but I find it hard to believe Iran may be much weaker militarily in another year or so, and that's not a bad thing. I don't think it's going to, I find it hard to see how they're going to become a stable, semi pro Western country.
Yeah, I think that's very unlikely. I think the most likely outcome here is going to be that you're going to have the same Iranian regime with a new leader, but in a weakened military state. And so, the analogy that is in my mind is kind of Iraq after the 1991 Gulf War, where Saddam Hussein was still in power and still had enough power to slaughter protesters rising up to challenge his rule, but was less of a threat to the region, but not an non. It wasn't like it was a non-existent threat. It was enough of a threat to lead George W. Bush to lead America to war again in 2003. And so my concern is that this is going to be another long-term quagmire for the United States of the kind, by the way, that Donald Trump promised to pull out of when he ran for president. This
No
is
more endless
the
wars,
opposite
Max.
of what he was saying.
No more endless wars. We know that. Put yourself in Tehran's shoes now. I know that's hard because we're not quite sure who is calling the shots. But what they are doing is they're striking targets in other Gulf countries. The administration says that's really counterproductive. On the other hand, maybe what their strategy is to have these countries who don't want a war bring pressure on Washington to stop this thing. Which do you think is more feasible, more reasonable, more likely?
I mean, I think that is their strategy. I think it's a twofold strategy. One is to put pressure on the Gulf states to in turn put pressure on Washington. And I'm sure Iran is very aware of the extent that MBZ in the UAE and MBS in Saudi Arabia, they exert massive influence over Trump in this White House. So if they're lobbying to end the war, that could have an impact. I think the other aspect of it is that Iran is simply trying to create turmoil and throw sand into the gears of the international economy, to lead to a spike in oil prices, to a decline in stock markets, on the assumption that that will put economic pressure on Trump to end the war. And basically, fundamentally, at the end of the day, I think the Iranian strategy is simply to hunker down, absorb the bombs and missiles in the expectation that they will be able to wait Trump out. I mean, he's basically put a timeline on this thing. It's going to last 4 weeks. I'm sure in the minds of Iranian leaders, they're thinking, well, our regime can survive 4 weeks of bombing. It's been here for, since 1979. It's a very entrenched regime. And so I think their view is that they have more patience than Trump, who everybody knows tends to be kind of hyperactive, and his attention can rapidly wane. And I think in some ways the analogy for the Iranians is what happened almost exactly a year ago with what the administration called Operation Rough Rider, where they started attacking the Houthis in Yemen and bombed them for nearly 2 months, but that bombing wasn't achieving that much. And finally, at the end of the day, Trump just negotiated kind of a face-saving deal with the Houthis and ended the bombing of the Houthis, very much still entrenched in power.
Yeah. James Carville.
So, Bags, am I correct as you were born in the Soviet Union?
You are correct.
Okay. So, and we talk about warfare. Okay. And let's talk about Stalingrad. I think that Stalingrad is instructive here. The Germans had a very successful bombing campaign. All right. They reduced Stalingrad to rubble, which ended up beating them, because then the Russians could hide everywhere. And their bombing was actually so successful, they lost a fucking battle. The entire Sixth Army had to surrender. So I guess you're a student of history, and I mean, Hitler's thing, if you just kick the door down, yeah, everything will be fine. Well, you kicked the door down, but it wasn't. It wasn't fine. And wars have a way of getting away from you, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't push the Stalingrad analogy too far because this is not a ground war, but I think you're correct in that what you can I think the larger takeaway from a lot of wars, whether it's the German invasion of Russia or the US invasion of Iraq or the Russian invasion of Ukraine more recently, you just pick a war. The basic takeaway that I have is wars are inherently risky and unpredictable, and it's very easy to start a war but very hard to end a war on your terms. Very, very hard. Very few wars end exactly the way that one side or the other wants. And so I just think that the Trump administration is taking a massive, massive risk here, even though we will all, I probably agree. I'm sure that the Iranian regime is odious. They have the blood of many Iranians and Israelis and Americans and many others on their hands. Ayatollah Khamenei was a horrible, evil ruler, all that kind of stuff. But you kick over the hornet's nest. You don't know what's going to happen, and I just I feel like, again, kind of a sense of deja vu with the 2003 Iraq War, and I think George Packer put it pretty well in The Atlantic when he wrote that compared to the Bush folks, the Trump folks have equal amounts of hubris, but a lot less idealism, and one of the many bizarre aspects of this war is sometimes Trump engages in George W. Bush style rhetoric about promoting democracy and the hour of freedom is at hand for Iran. But the rest of the time, he's anti-democracy both at home and abroad and is making deals with dictators. And in fact, in Venezuela, made a deal with their dictator to replace the dictator that he kidnapped. And I think he's made pretty obvious that he'd be happy to make a deal with a dictator in Iran if he could find somebody to make a deal with. So it's just a mess, and there are just so many ways this could go wrong.
Okay, let's go back to the Iraq thing and Bush. Okay, I wasn't part of that war, but I didn't like Bush. But it was, to me, it was everything. But there was an intellectual basis for it. It was actually a thought that the American military. It turned out it wasn't. It didn't work out the way we thought, but people actually had an idea that through American power we could change people, we could put a new regime in, that we could remake the world. But there was and people like yourself and George, by the way, okay, there was actually some idea behind it, and they were like serious people that thought this and thought it for not nefarious reasons, that they thought it would work. And I mean, we all do shit in our lives that we think is going to work, and it turned out it didn't work. But what intelligent people do is they learn from it. Is there any intellectual basis? Is there like the Claremont Institute? Are they producing papers as to why this is a good thing? Or do you know of anything like that? I mean, you're pretty plugged into that world.
I mean, I think to some of the MAGA base, this is kind of a shock because this isn't what they signed up for, because they thought that Trump was going to be the president of peace. As he himself said, he's going to end wars, not start them. But I think with most of the MAGA base, they're behind Trump because, as he himself said, Trump is MAGA, and it's basically a cult following. So whatever Trump does, they will fall in behind him. But it is shocking to me because, part of the reason why Trump was elected president was also the part of the reason why Barack Obama was elected president was part of this American backlash against these wars of choice and regime change in the Middle East. And here we are in another war of choice and another war of regime change in the Middle East.
Yeah, I just want to make an observation. You talked about the MAGA base. The MAGA base is not sufficient to win very many elections. Okay, and what my ideal is that Trump, his approval among Republicans, by the way, is starting to deteriorate. I mean, if your disapproval among Democrats is 93 and your approval among Republicans is 85, that's 8 points. That's a lot. The thing about politics is small numbers get amplified.
Right.
And my ideal is for his Republican,
especially in midterms, I would think
75, but no lower. Where you can stay on the burning ship or you can jump in the ice cold water, but there's only two choices you got, because you can't win a general election with him and you can't win a primary without him, and it's an advantageous political position to find yourself in. And if he lost to MAGA base, then fuck the other one wouldn't feel drawn in. You follow where I'm coming from on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this is certainly not going to help him, Republicans politically in the fall. And I think Trump and the White House are very aware of that. And I think that's part of the reason why there's a ticking clock on this intervention, why he's talking about 4 weeks as his timeline. I think he's concerned about the economic fallout. I think there's concern within the military about drawing down U.S. munition stockpiles to dangerous levels. And there's also, I think, concern about creating a political backlash and adding to the albatross that Republicans are carrying around their necks heading into November. So for all those reasons, I think Trump is incentivized to end the war sooner rather than later.
So, Max, before I turn it over out, you're not a Democrat. I understand that, but you observe American politics. Thoughtful guy with a steep. Is there any Democrat that you see out there, that potential presidential candidate, that you would find kind of intriguing to add? If I could spend 20 minutes with this person, I'd like to do a column on him or something. Do you find anybody in the current Democratic filament that's being mentioned as a potential presidential campaign interesting, or somebody you think has something to say that you want to listen to?
I mean, I think the Democrats have a bunch of, credible potential presidents on the bench, whether,
Right.
The obvious names, Gavin Newsom, Josh Shapiro, Andy Beshear, Wes Moore, maybe. I'm sure there are others. I mean,
Right.
uh, a lot of them seem, like pretty credible alternatives.
Right. I think, coming from a guy like you, it's like, you obviously don't like what you got, to say the least. But I do think, and I'm glad to hear you say that, because I am just impressed. And I'm saying this, I think, as a talent evaluator, not a partisan. The level of talent in the Democratic Party right now is unbelievably high. And I don't think and I don't want people to anticipate it. I want them to see it. But I was at conference with a lot of these statewide candidates, and some of them are just, I mean, blow you away talent. But Rob Sand, I'm sorry, he just blows you away with his talent. David Jolly, you gotta go down to Florida and talk to David. Okay, he's a former Republican congressman. He was actually kind of a deficit scholar almost. I mean, he was a very thoughtful guy, and he's crossed Jordan, man. He's really crossed Jordan. But those are some guys I think that are Max Boot.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
I mean,
Al.
I would just add to that. I think some of the most impressive figures in the Democratic Party are the veterans. I think folks like
Oh,
Jason
okay.
Crow, Seth Moulton, Wes Moore,
Oh,
Mark Kelly, various others. I think
right.
they're
Alyssa Slotkin. There's a
Yeah.
whole bunch. Max, let me just ask you a couple. I know you have to go, but I think this is an illegal war, in the think that I think the Constitution requires the president. This was not a preemptive war to go to Congress and get authority. He had no interest in doing that. Instead, he did spend time consulting the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. What did MBS get out of this, and what do you think Trump got out of this?
I mean, it's a little bit hard to read where MBS and Saudi Arabia are coming from, because there's dueling reports. On the one hand, reports that they were opposed to military action because they were worried about the blowback for obvious reasons. I think maybe MBS got on board when it was obvious the train was leaving the station, but I just don't see MBS as being the prime mover behind this. I think it's really Trump and Netanyahu who ginned up this war
Yeah.
together.
And
And
did Netanyahu come out of this stronger?
well, he hasn't come out of it yet, but
That's true. Good
uh,
point.
but I mean, there is an election in Israel this year, and I think he's basically getting to do what he's always wanted to do. I mean, he's been talking for 20 years about removing the Iranian threat, and he's finally getting to do it. And so I think he's able uh, to probably make a lot of Israeli voters forget about the failure to prevent the October 7th attack. And now he's going to, try to seek re-election as the man who saved Israel from Iran. I mean, we'll see how it plays out. But obviously, I think Israelis are generally in favor of this war, but not so much the case in the U.S., where most people are opposed to it.
I talked to someone who's an expert pollster on Israeli public opinion who agrees that Israelis, at least for now, so much favor this, but they say they have not forgotten about October 7th, that that's something that is deeper than Netanyahu would like. But let me ask you, I am not a conspiracy peddler, Max. I promise you I am not. But I can't rule out a wag the dog element here. That was the movie where a president staged a war to knock a sex scandal and political problems off the front page. I don't know any other president I would have said that about, but with Trump, I think you can't rule that out.
Um, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I mean, I can't read his psychology, but I mean, Democrats for months have been saying that every single thing that Trump does is an attempt to distract from the Epstein scandal. I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical because I think, Trump is sharp enough to understand that he's running huge risks here, that this thing could easily blow up in his face. So, if this is not like this is not like 1 or 2 days of bombing or just killing one leader or something like that. This is a major war with massive repercussions. And even if he hasn't given serious thought to how those repercussions will play out, I mean, I think he's got to be aware that this is a major gamble and one that, as I say, could easily go against him. And frankly, from a political standpoint, I'm not sure how it would help him in any case because I don't think a lot of people are going to be turning out to the ballot box in November saying, "Hey, I'm going to vote for Republicans because Trump killed Ayatollah Khamenei." I just don't see that as a likely scenario. I think most Americans are either opposed or indifferent to this conflict.
Yeah, I agree with you. Max has got to go. James, do you have something else that you'd like to
I
add
just,
or ask our
well, I got
distinguished guest?
Max here for 90 seconds. I want to make a point. Maybe Trump is doing this because he wants to have some legacy achievement. And he's thinking about where it is. Maybe he's doing it to deflect from the Epstein case. I actually am more cynical than both of those explanations. I think Trump is scared to death of the November election, and he's already said it. And in the back of his reptilian mind, he thinks the more disorder that he can generate, the better excuse he has for calling off the election. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I actually believe this. I think he knows if he loses the election, he's done with Epstein because the Democrats are going to subpoena everything, including him. All right, as long as he's got a Republican Congress, and and he's kind of protected, and he knows that November is a swift and impending doom, and he will do everything that he can to have a rationale for calling the election off. I think that's what motivates him. I don't think legacy motivates him. I think he knows that if he loses, he's done with Epstein, but the election is foremost in his mind. That's my view.
Could be. Again, I can't get inside his head, and clearly he wants to uh, influence the outcome of the November election by means, fair or foul. But I'm just not sure that I agree that his presidency is over if Democrats win in November, because his presidency really doesn't depend on getting legislation approved. It's all about executive action. And, I'm not sure to what extent Democrats can impede his executive action, especially when it comes to foreign affairs.
Well,
Military.
Max, I know you have to go. I would just add, you're right, but there will be accountability. Those subpoenas will drive them crazy. There is so much stuff, if they do it wisely and selectively to investigate, there's so much corruption that it won't stop his presidency, but it will give him more than a giant headache.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, I
Listen,
think there's still a lot of room for his action, even if the Democrats are in control of Congress.
I'm afraid I agree. You have been a fabulous guest, James. I think we agree.
Great guest. I'd like anytime you want to come back, Max. I love your perspective, and you've seen and lived through a lot of history and studied a lot of history in your life, and we're very fortunate to be able to get your insight on some of these things. And like anybody that's been in public policy for a long time, you got some good calls and bad calls, and the thing is, you learn from your good calls, but you learn more from your bad calls. Best of luck to you, man.
Yeah, well, I've got a lot to learn from, so thanks for having me on.